quiet shadow of a war-torn world, beneath the looming tension of hidden villages vying for dominance, a nameless child wandered, hollow-eyed and forgotten. No clan bore his name. No legacy carved his identity into the stone walls of history. Instead, he was simply Kabuto, a boy discarded like so many others in the wake of conflict, left to be swept into the margins where silence was safer than existence. Orphaned in the chaos left behind by the Second Great Ninja War, Kabuto's first memories were of the orphanage, a humble, peaceful place tucked away in the outskirts of the Hidden Leaf, where kindness lived in fleeting whispers and the world was reduced to the quiet routine of survival. It was there, beneath dim candlelight, and over meals that never quite filled the stomach, that Kabuto met the woman who would shape the earliest definition of family he'd ever know. Nonō Yakushi, called Mother by the children she sheltered, gave Kabuto a name, a bed, and the sense, however fragile, that he mattered. Kabuto's early days were marked by the desire to belong, to be seen. He wasn't the strongest or the loudest, but he noticed things. He listened. His memory became his most valuable tool, and with it, he helped the orphanage however he could. Simple errands, assisting with basic medical tasks, memorizing names, faces, herbs, wounds. It was Nonō who first gave him a pair of glasses, slightly too big, sliding off his nose. And in that gesture was a form of affection he could neither name nor fully understand. Those glasses became a part of him, a soft barrier between the world and his yearning eyes, reflecting back a child quietly desperate to prove his worth. He would wake early, work late, study tirelessly, trying to be helpful, trying to be useful, trying not to be left behind again. But even the orphanage, a place that should have offered sanctuary, could not shield him from the larger world. The Hidden Leaf's demands grew heavier in the wake of war, and its shinobi machinery churned endlessly, always seeking new tools, new talents to wield and discard as needed. When the foundation, a shadowy limb of Konoha's will, came to call, Kabuto, with his keen memory and unassuming nature, was deemed a perfect fit. And so, without resistance, he was pulled into the current of espionage, trained in deception, taught to infiltrate, observe, record, and forget. He didn't resist. He believed that doing this work was another way to help the village, to help Nonō, to be useful. Each mission sent him deeper into other lands, into enemy villages, hidden corners, forgotten paths. He changed names, faces, voices. He became invisible. But with each transformation, he lost a little more of himself. The boy who had simply wanted to be loved faded into the operative who survived by becoming anyone but himself. Loneliness clung to him like a second skin, and the mask he wore for each assignment began to feel more real than whatever self remained beneath. And then, in a cruel twist engineered by those who profited from obedience, the mission that shattered everything came. Kabuto was tasked with eliminating a perceived threat, a rogue operative from Konoha suspected of betrayal. But when he caught sight of the target, it wasn't a stranger. It was Nonō, the woman who'd called him son, who'd given him a name, and those glasses, and hope. She didn't recognize him. The child she'd raised was so buried beneath his disguises, his missions, his lies, that even her eyes couldn't see him. And in a single instant, the illusion of purpose crumbled. A blow was exchanged, reflexive, defensive, and she was gone. Her blood stained his hands, not because of malice, but because of manipulation. Because he'd been used again. Kabuto ran, then. He fled from the Foundation, from Konoha, from the memory of her final gaze that didn't recognize the boy she'd once held close. He vanished into the wind, leaving behind everything he'd ever known. And in that void, consumed by grief, confusion, and a shattered identity, he wandered. Not as a shinobi, not as a healer, not even as a son. Just a ghost drifting through the undercurrent of the ninja world, no longer searching for approval, but for meaning. He would soon meet the man who promised to give him that meaning. A serpent who slithered through the cracks of the world with a voice smooth as silk and a vision as terrifying as it was vast. Orochimaru, the man who saw Kabuto not as a tool, but as a kindred spirit, broken, brilliant, malleable. Under Orochimaru's wing, Kabuto began to rebuild himself, not as the forgotten child of an orphanage, but as something more, something sharper, something necessary. He studied medicine with obsessive precision, learned forbidden jutsu with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. And in his master's footsteps, he walked the path of transformation, body, mind, and soul. But even as he grew stronger, Kabuto's past lingered like a phantom. Every skill he acquired, every experiment he conducted, every village he manipulated, was haunted by a single question. Who am I? Was he the helpful boy from the orphanage? The killer shaped by Danzo's will? The assistant to a snake who whispered power in his ear? Or had he become something else entirely? Something not bound by names or allegiances, but shaped only by his desire to finally understand himself. As the night deepens and Kabuto's story unfurls with quiet sorrow, the stillness of sleep creeps in like mist through forgotten corridors. The sound of his steps on hidden floors, the whisper of scrolls unfurling, the soft clink of surgical tools, all of it becomes a lullaby of reinvention, the tale of a boy cast adrift by war, who sought to find his name again, and in doing so became something far greater and far more lost than he ever imagined. In the dim corridors of Orochimaru's many hidden laboratories, surrounded by jars of preserved secrets and the quiet hum of forbidden science, Kabuto found a strange sort of comfort. The world above was chaotic and cruel, filled with shifting alliances and the weight of expectation. But here, in this stillness beneath the earth, time seemed to slow. Every incision, every experiment, every note scribbled in the margins of a tattered journal brought a sense of order, of clarity. Orochimaru's presence was a constant, a looming figure of ambition and intellect, whose twisted vision offered Kabuto the closest thing to a purpose he had felt since the orphanage. And under that cold, watchful gaze, Kabuto grew, not just in power, but in conviction. He dissected truths along with bodies, learning not only anatomy, but how identity itself could be deconstructed and remade. He watched Orochimaru peel back the skin of mortality, experimenting with immortality and forbidden jutsu, pushing past the bounds of what shinobi were supposed to be. And in those shadows, Kabuto began to question the very nature of self. If flesh could be altered, if memories could be tampered with, if a soul could inhabit another's body, what then was a person? What remained when all the pieces were changed? He asked these questions, not aloud, but in silence, as his hands worked tirelessly, stitching flesh and sealing chakra pathways. He began collecting identities, much like Orochimaru. Blood samples, DNA, traits from powerful shinobi. A bit of this, a fragment of that. Kabuto wasn't just learning, he was preparing, creating backups, altering himself, slowly, subtly. It started with enhancements, an improved healing factor, keener senses, but over time, the changes became more profound. He wasn't simply imitating Orochimaru, he was surpassing him, and part of him knew it. Still, he remained in Orochimaru's shadow for years, serving, assisting, watching, through the destruction of the hidden leaf, through the battles with the Akatsuki, through the unraveling of plans, both brilliant and grotesque. Kabuto was always there, observing from the margins, quietly absorbing every lesson. He saw how Orochimaru's arrogance often led to his downfall, how he underestimated others, how he trusted too much in his own invincibility. And Kabuto took notes, not just for science, but for survival. When Orochimaru finally fell, brought low by Sasuke's blade and his own hubris, Kabuto didn't grieve. He didn't rage. He simply adapted. With calm, surgical precision, he retrieved what remained of his master and absorbed it, literally. Not just the knowledge, but the flesh, the abilities, the legacy. In taking Orochimaru into himself, Kabuto believed he was continuing the work. But deeper still, it was something more personal, a culmination of years spent as a shadow. He was no longer anyone's assistant. He was the experimenter and the subject, the researcher and the result. But there was still an emptiness, still that same quiet question that had followed him since he was a child. Who am I, really? And in search of that answer, Kabuto turned his gaze outward, toward the Akatsuki, toward the great stage of conflict. If identity was forged through conflict and purpose, then perhaps it was time he stepped out of the shadows and shaped the world himself, not as Kabuto the orphan, or Kabuto the medic, or even Kabuto the disciple, but as something else entirely. So he approached Toby, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. He brought with him a trump card, the forbidden reanimation jutsu, perfected through his own experimentation, and not just a few souls. An entire army of the dead, carefully selected, finely tuned, weapons of war from every age. His knowledge was deeper than most could imagine, and his grasp of the technique more refined than even its original creator. This was his power, his offering, his place on the stage. Toby accepted the alliance, but Kabuto knew he wasn't trusted. He didn't need to be. What mattered was leverage, and Kabuto had plenty. Knowledge of secrets no one else remembered. Control of legendary shinobi, long since turned to dust. His own body, now modified beyond recognition, filled with the DNA and abilities of some of the strongest warriors in history. In the mirror, he no longer saw a boy in two large glasses. He saw a serpent with silver hair and slitted eyes, a creature of shifting flesh and endless adaptability. And yet, the more Kabuto changed himself, the further he drifted from any true sense of identity. The more powerful he became, the more he was haunted by that orphan's question. Was he someone now, or just a patchwork of borrowed pieces? As the wind carried whispers of the coming war, Kabuto moved in silence, pulling strings behind the curtain. The boy who once yearned for approval now sought affirmation in domination. Perhaps through this war, through this great upheaval, he would finally define himself, not as someone who served or survived, but as someone who shaped the world. The fourth great ninja war loomed on the horizon, like a storm swelling in the distance. And Kabuto Yakushi, now a figure neither man nor monster, stood at the edge of it, not as an observer, but as a conductor. The battlefield, as far as he was concerned, was more than a place for armies to clash. It was a forge for truths, a crucible where identities were shattered and reforged. Kabuto had spent years preparing for this, long before the first swords were drawn, long before he ever offered his allegiance to Toby. Each corpse he had unearthed, each soul he had bound with reanimation, each fragment of DNA he had absorbed into his own shifting body. All of it was a step toward a moment he had dreamed of since boyhood. A moment where the world would have no choice but to recognize him, not as a subordinate, not as a shadow, but as the force behind the curtain, the architect of chaos. With the reanimation, jutsu perfected, Kabuto's reach extended into the past, pulling legends into the present, not merely to fight, but to send a message. He didn't just resurrect shinobi. He curated them. Selected warriors with the most symbolic weight, the most emotional impact. He unearthed the famed 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist, reassembled them with their blades and brutality. He called back powerful Kage, ones thought lost to history, men and women who had once shaped nations. Even Itachi Uchiha, the silent shadow whose legacy haunted the present, was among Kabuto's prizes. Every soul he revived was a thread in his tapestry of war, woven with intent, designed to disorient and devastate. He wasn't trying to win through brute strength. He was trying to collapse the enemy from within. And behind each revived warrior stood Kabuto, cloaked in scales, his serpent-like form half draped in darkness. He had long since cast away his original body. His appearance now was unsettling, elongated, inhuman, his voice a soft whisper laced with arrogance. He did not flinch at the thought of war. He welcomed it, bathed in it, convinced it would answer the riddle that had plagued him since the orphanage. Who was Kabuto Yakushi? A name? A body? A collection of abilities and memories? Or something more elusive, an idea waiting to manifest? While the world watched Toby and the Eye of the Moon plan unfold, Kabuto worked behind the scenes like a puppeteer. The white masks and crimson clouds of the Akatsuki drew the attention, but the shadows cast by the resurrected were his doing. He was subtle in his manipulation, nudging events here, correcting them there. But within the quiet moments, alone in his cavernous lair, surrounded by talismans and scrolls, he stared into still water and found only a shifting reflection. The experiments, the power, the knowledge, they all led him deeper into himself, but never closer to clarity. Yet it was only when he brought back Itachi Uchiha and sent him into battle that Kabuto's path began to twist in unexpected ways. He had expected resistance, perhaps even insight. But what he encountered was something he hadn't prepared for. Itachi's quiet resolve, his unwavering will, even in death. Unlike the other revived shinobi, Itachi acted with purpose, independent of Kabuto's control. Through sheer force of intellect and will, he resisted the bindings of the reanimation jutsu, moving toward his own ends rather than Kabuto's. And those ends led him to Sasuke, another mirror Kabuto had once glimpsed himself in. A fellow orphan, a fellow seeker, a fellow shadow of greatness. But Sasuke's story had diverged. He had burned with vengeance, then grief, then purpose. Kabuto had once tried to understand him, then surpass him. Now he saw Sasuke again through the veil of war, a figure lost between brotherhood and ambition. When the two Uchiha confronted Kabuto deep within a sealed cave, the moment was more than a battle. It was a collision of philosophies. Kabuto, now grotesque and serpent-like, had fused himself with Orochimaru's essence, taken on the DNA of the Sound Five, even absorbed traits from Jugo and Suigetsu. He had become a living experiment, a shifting mosaic of shinobi evolution. And he stood before Itachi and Sasuke as the culmination of his life's work, a being who had tried to overcome his lack of identity by collecting the identities of others. But Itachi saw through him. With words sharper than kunai, he dissected Kabuto, not physically, but philosophically. He recognized Kabuto's emptiness, the fragile ego buried beneath the scales and borrowed power. It wasn't cruelty. It was understanding, the kind Kabuto had never received as a child, as a spy, as an apprentice. In trying to be everything, Itachi told him, Kabuto had become nothing. The battle that followed was intense and precise. Kabuto fought with desperation, masked as confidence, wielding every trick, every ability, every strategy he had absorbed over the years. His senses were heightened. His body adapted on the fly. He moved like a serpent, struck like a beast. But Itachi's calm, paired with Sasuke's fury, pressed him steadily toward defeat. And when Itachi activated Izanami, a forbidden Uchiha technique that trapped the victim in a looping reality, it wasn't violence that overcame Kabuto, but reflection. He was caught not in chains, but in a cycle of his own memories, his own actions repeating endlessly. Every failure, every decision, every justification, again and again. Time no longer mattered. Only recognition did. The technique would never end until Kabuto accepted the truth of who he was. And in that timeless space, Kabuto began to see. Not all at once, but slowly, painfully. The mask began to crack. He saw the child at the orphanage, desperate for identity. The spy, without a name. The medic, who mimicked others. The student, who wanted to matter. The man who became a monster to feel like someone. He saw it all, and for the first time didn't flinch. Inside the looping reality of the Izanami, time unraveled. For Kabuto, there was no clear beginning or end, only the endless repetition of moments that once defined him. Again and again, he experienced the same sequence, the drawing of blood, the casting of jutsu, the echo of his own voice through a throat not fully his. And every time he reached the moment of triumph, the loop snapped back to the start. No matter how fiercely he resisted, how desperately he altered his tactics, the outcome remained unchanged. Izanami wasn't a punishment. It was a mirror. And Kabuto, who had spent a lifetime constructing identities from fragments of others, was being forced to face the one thing he had always avoided: himself. It was an elegant cruelty, but one born of compassion. Itachi didn't want to destroy Kabuto. He wanted to save him. Even in death, even within the horrors of war, Itachi chose mercy through clarity. And slowly, Kabuto began to see the shape of the truth. He was not Orochimaru, not a clone, not a shadow, not a perfect successor. He was not the child the orphanage remembered, nor the spy Root had molded. He was not the medic, nor the monster, nor the pale reflection of any one master. For so long, he had chased recognition, believing that power would define him. But the more he consumed, the more he lost. It wasn't identity he had acquired. It was noise. And in the stillness of repetition, Kabuto found a silence he had never known. He let go, not of power, but of the need to be someone else. And in that moment of acceptance, the loop ended. The jutsu faded. And when he awoke, blinking in the dim cave light, he was different. Not in body, his snake-like form remained. But something internal had shifted, something foundational. He had seen the falsehood of his path. For the first time, perhaps in his entire life, he knew who he was, not because of what he had taken, but because of what he had finally released. Kabuto did not die in that cave. Instead, he disappeared from the battlefield, not as a fugitive, but as a man seeking a different kind of redemption. He returned to the very place where his life had begun to fracture, the orphanage. Now, no longer seeking to escape the place that had once defined his loneliness. He returned to it as a healer, not a conqueror. The war raged on beyond those walls, but Kabuto found peace in small things, caring for wounded children, tending to the sick, speaking softly, not trying to impress or dominate, but simply exist. It was a strange grace, and one he had never known to seek until it found him through pain and reflection. But Kabuto's story didn't vanish with the war. Though he removed himself from the conflict, his actions had left a scar across the shinobi world. The reanimation. Jutsu had altered the nature of warfare, forcing nations and clans to confront ghosts they thought buried. Bonds were tested not just by the clash of ideals, but by the unnatural return of those long gone. Kabuto had held a mirror to the world as much as he had to himself, and not all who looked into it were ready for what they saw. Even so, Itachi's final gift to Kabuto, a chance at self-awareness, resonated deeper than any summoning scroll or stolen Kekkei Genkai. It forced the world to remember that the most powerful jutsu weren't those that destroyed armies, but those that changed hearts. Kabuto, whose hands had once brought only pain, now used them to mend, whose voice had once echoed commands and incantations, now offered comfort in quiet rooms. And when he looked into the mirror, he no longer saw fragments. He saw Kabuto. Not perfect, not legendary, but real. Yet the world did not stand still. With the war nearing its climax, the ripple effects of Kabuto's jutsu still moved outward. The strongest of the revived, Madara Uchiha, remained unleashed, unbound by Kabuto's control. The spell that gave Madara flesh had been crafted too well. Even with Kabuto's defeat and reflection, the monster he helped resurrect walked free, beyond the reach of both redemption and remorse. And though Kabuto had stepped away, his legacy loomed large on the battlefield. Sasuke, too, was changed by that confrontation. He had watched Itachi act not with hatred, but with wisdom, compassion, and sacrifice. It was the final lesson his brother would teach him, not through violence, but through the transformation of another. Kabuto had been a mirror, yes, but also a warning. Power alone did not grant purpose. Identity forged through vengeance was as fragile as the bonds it broke. Sasuke would carry that lesson forward, uncertain, but no longer blind. As for Kabuto, the war's end came quietly for him. He remained at the orphanage, a quiet figure in the background of history. Children knew him only as the strange, soft-spoken caretaker who rarely slept. They did not see the battles behind his eyes, or the faces that once haunted his dreams. He never sought titles or forgiveness. He only lived, each day stitched together with purpose, not power. And in this strange peace, Kabuto finally answered the question that had once consumed him. Who was he? Not Orochimaru's heir, not a puppet of Root, not a weapon or an echo. He was Kabuto Yakushi, survivor, student, seeker, and now, perhaps for the first time, simply himself, far away from the fading echoes of war and the shifting tides of nations. Kabuto remained, not a specter lurking in shadows, nor a menace biding time, but a quiet, contemplative figure who had finally stepped off the stage. He did not crave recognition anymore. The name Kabuto Yakushi no longer carried the weight of masks or borrowed legacies. It was simply his own. The orphanage walls that once confined him now embraced him. Every creaking wooden floorboard and every soft voice of a child needing help reminded him that he could be of value without needing to dominate, deceive, or impress. Each morning, he rose not to pursue power, but to offer comfort, not to rewrite history, but to gently tend to the present. But even as Kabuto retreated into this newfound life, the world outside trembled on the edge of its most chaotic reckoning. His actions, like stones cast into still water, continued to send ripples that disturbed the peace he now lived within. The reanimation technique he had perfected, his greatest feat and his greatest sin, had not been undone. Though his consciousness had been freed, and though he had removed himself from the great game of shinobi war, the jutsu he had unleashed carried a momentum of its own. Madara Uchiha had returned with flesh and fury, untethered from Kabuto's command, and no amount of regret could stop what had been set in motion. Kabuto had believed once that knowledge was the ultimate form of control, that by understanding the biology of the body, the psychology of pain, and the mechanisms of chakra, he could ascend above weakness. But the consequences of his choices had proven otherwise. In seeking to understand everything, he had unleashed forces he could never fully contain. There was irony in that, the scientist undone by his own success. But perhaps that was the final lesson. that no matter how deeply one studied, how far one reached, there were limits that could not be bent by will alone. In the caves where he had once stitched life into corpses, Kabuto's presence was now a fading memory. The scrolls, the tools, the dark tanks where he had grown new life, they had been left behind, sealed or destroyed. The boy who had once feared obscurity more than death had walked away from his own lab, from the heart of his ambition. What remained was the Kabuto who wiped tears from children's faces, who bandaged scraped knees and sat beside cots at night when nightmares wouldn't leave. A Kabuto who had once brought back the dead now comforted the living. Still, in quiet moments, when the wind stirred the orphanage curtains and the world felt still, Kabuto would sometimes close his eyes and remember, not in longing or regret, but in contemplation. He remembered Orochimaru, his mentor, tormentor, mirror, the snake-like voice that had once coaxed him into darkness, that had offered him a place of belonging laced with control. Kabuto had once believed Orochimaru's vision was the only truth, that individuality could only be preserved through evolution, through ceaseless adaptation. But in the end, even Orochimaru had been forced to reconsider. When Kabuto emerged from the Izanami's grip, it was not to continue his predecessor's path, but to reject it. There was something poetic in that, something cyclical. The student who surpassed the master, not in power, but in humility. Orochimaru had chased immortality with unrelenting obsession. Kabuto, once his echo, had stepped back and allowed himself to be mortal again. And in doing so, he found a kind of peace that all of Orochimaru's stolen bodies and forbidden experimenta had never granted. He didn't need to live forever. He only needed to live honestly, for however long he had left. Elsewhere, in the wake of war's devastation, the villages began to rebuild. The Shinobi Alliance had been tested like never before, forged in the crucible of shared loss and desperate cooperation. And while many would never know Kabuto's role, or the redemption he had quietly earned, those whose lives he had touched now carried his name with something approaching reverence. The children he cared for didn't know his past, didn't need to. To them, he was not a former enemy or a reformed villain. He was simply Kabuto-sensei, the quiet man with strange eyes who always knew what to say when the world felt too heavy. And when Naruto Uzumaki, now a hero to all, heard whispers of Kabuto's new life, he did not pursue him for justice or confrontation. Instead, he allowed the man to remain in peace. Naruto understood better than anyone that people could change. He had seen too many enemies become friends, too many broken paths lead back to light. And in Kabuto, he saw not the villain who had once reanimated the dead, but the man who had looked into the abyss and turned away. Still, there were questions Kabuto would never be able to answer. Wounds he would always carry. The faces of those he brought back, Jiraiya, Dan, Itachi, and countless others, lingered in his memory, not as trophies, but as reminders. Each name a quiet prayer, each face a testament to the cost of ambition without empathy. He would never erase what he had done, but he could spend the rest of his life tending to the scars left behind, not just on others, but within himself. Night fell gently over the hills. Beyond the orphanage, casting long shadows across the earth as the last traces of sunlight bled away. In that quiet darkness, Kabuto often found his clearest thoughts, not the analytical musings of the past, those obsessive calculations and anatomical blueprints, but soft reflections. He would sit by the window after the children had gone to bed, the floor creaking under the weight of memory more than body. And in those long hours of silence, he did not see the battles or jutsu or twisted experiments of his former life. He saw faces, hundreds of faces, some that had smiled at him once, others that had screamed, and among them, always, Itachi. He had not expected to meet someone like Itachi Uchiha, much less be unmade by him. But unmade was the only word that felt true. Itachi had never screamed, never raged. He had moved with purpose, precise and merciless, yet tempered by something Kabuto hadn't understood until it was far too late. Compassion. It wasn't a kindness that spared or comforted. It was a compassion rooted in truth. A mirror held up without judgment, without cruelty. And when Kabuto had looked into it, he'd seen himself for the first time. Not the form he had crafted, not the power he had gathered, but the child still hiding beneath layers of ambition and borrowed identity. Izanami. That cruel, beautiful technique. Kabuto had believed himself immune to defeat by illusion. But Izanami was not an illusion meant to deceive. It was one meant to reveal. The cycle it trapped him in, endless, inescapable, wasn't a punishment, but a lesson. Again and again, he was forced to confront his own decisions, his own fear, his refusal to accept who he was. And as time lost meaning inside that eternal loop, something inside him began to break, not in pain, but in surrender. A surrender not to weakness, but to reality. It was only when he finally accepted his true self, the self without masks or roles or ambitions, that the loop shattered. And with it, so did the person he had been. That awakening was not dramatic. There was no triumphant music or sudden clarity. It was quiet, gentle, like opening one's eyes after a long, fevered sleep. And when he looked around him, blinking in the half-light of Itachi's presence, he saw not judgment, but understanding. The older Uchiha had walked a harder road, borne a heavier burden, and yet he had still reached out to Kabuto, not to destroy him, but to save him. That act, the choice to spare someone so far gone, had resonated deeper than any jutsu or revelation. It was not chakra that had changed Kabuto. It was mercy. And so, he had returned, not to power, but to purpose, a different kind of strength. The strength to care, to heal, to serve. The orphanage had become his home, not because it was where he began, but because it was where he chose to begin again. And every day, as he offered kindness to children who had no one else, he offered it also to himself. Piece by piece, quietly and without fanfare, Kabuto Yakushi began to heal, but the world did not stop turning. In the new age of peace, ushered in by Naruto and his allies, threats still simmered in distant lands. The shinobi system, while changed, was not abolished, and Kabuto, despite his retreat from it all, remained tethered to its legacy. Occasionally, whispers would find him. Visitors from villages seeking knowledge, rogue ninja asking for forbidden secrets, even emissaries from Konoha testing the waters of trust. But Kabuto declined them all with the same quiet certainty. He was no longer a man of war or shadow. His jutsu now were for broken bones and fevers, not conquest. Still, he was not naive. He knew that his past was never truly behind him. There would be some who would never forgive, who would never forget the things he had done, the lives he had desecrated in his pursuit of perfection. He did not expect absolution. He did not need it. What mattered was the present moment. This moment. The smile of a child learning to read. The soft breath of a sleeping toddler curled against his shoulder. The warmth of a meal shared. The comfort of a story told before bed. These were not acts of redemption. They were acts of life. And even as years began to pass, as his face bore the slow changes of time, Kabuto found contentment in their simplicity. The need to impress, to dominate, to define himself against others, these had faded. In their place was something softer, quieter, and infinitely more enduring. A truth learned not in battle, but in surrender. He had tried to become everyone but himself, and in the end, he had finally arrived at the only identity that mattered, his own. In the forest behind the orphanage, the wind carried the scent of spring. New flowers, bright and fragile, rose from the earth, and Kabuto, walking alone among them, paused to breathe deeply. There was no mask on his face, no jutsu on his lips, just the air, the earth, and the stillness of peace. For a moment, he closed his eyes, and in that moment, there was no war, no Orochimaru, no pain. There was only the soft, steady beat of a heart finally at ease. The seasons rolled forward, slow and patient, painting the forest in endless variations of color. The orphanage remained nestled between the trees, like a breath held in gentle balance, untouched by the chaos that once raged through the world. Kabuto had found rhythm in this quiet life, waking early with the dawn, tending to the small garden, preparing breakfast before the sound of children's footsteps echoed down the hallways. Their laughter filled the air like birdsong, unburdened, unaware of who he had once been. And perhaps That was the greatest mercy of all. Not forgiveness, not forgetfulness, but innocence. They saw him not as Kabuto the betrayer, not as the apprentice of Orochimaru, not as the war criminal who once manipulated life and death like playthings, but simply as Kabuto-sensei. The man who bandaged scraped knees, told stories by candlelight, and listened with gentle eyes and steady hands. Still, sometimes the nights were long. Sleep did not always come easily. There were dreams, shifting, uneasy things, echoes of past selves and past mistakes. He saw Yakushi Nonō reaching for him through bloodied hands. He saw Orochimaru's grin, wide and cruel. He heard the screams of dying shinobi, saw the endless cycle of the Edo Tensei puppets returning again and again to battle. And sometimes he saw Sasuke and Itachi walking through the fog of memory, distant and silent. But each time he woke, sweat on his brow and the darkness heavy around him, he would rise, drink water, walk barefoot through the wooden halls, and remind himself where he was now. Not underground in a lab, not inside a hideout surrounded by corpses and scrolls, but home. That word, home, had never meant much to Kabuto in his early years. The orphanage had once been shelter, but not belonging. His years with Orochimaru had offered purpose, but not acceptance. Only now, after walking through fire, through delusion and defeat, had he truly found it. And with that realization came a humility he had never known before. He no longer sought greatness. He no longer chased meaning through power. His path was no longer one of ambition, but of care. Each day was an act of devotion. Each meal prepared, each story shared, each wound tended, was a quiet affirmation that he had chosen to live differently. Sometimes he was visited by familiar faces. A letter came once from Konoha, bearing no accusations, only acknowledgement. It was short, formal, but it spoke volumes in what it didn't say. Kabuto knew they were watching him, still weighing the scales of trust. But he did not resent it. He had watched the world burn. He had helped set the fire. It was enough that they let him live in peace. On rare occasions, others came in person. Shino Aburam had once walked the narrow trail through the woods, quiet and thoughtful as ever. He had asked few questions, made fewer judgments, and left with a faint nod, as though silently granting respect for Kabuto's quiet penance. Naruto himself never came, though Kabuto sometimes thought he might. But perhaps that absence was the truest kindness. No confrontation, no forced apology, just the space to heal. In the end, Kabuto's legacy was not written in stone. He would not be named in the textbooks beside the great heroes. His story was not one of triumph or glory. It was a story of failure and of what one did after. A story of a boy who became lost in a world of shifting faces and shifting loyalties. who lost himself so completely that he forgot his own name. A boy who at the end of all things saw the truth reflected in another's eyes and chose, at last, to stop running. He knew that he could never undo what had been done. The lives lost, the pain caused, the years spent manipulating the threads of life and death like some mad puppeteer. These were not things that could be erased. But he had come to understand that redemption was not a destination. It was a road. A long, slow road, walked not in grand gestures, but in small, daily choices. To be kind, to be patient, to be better. On one particularly quiet evening, Kabuto stood beneath the stars, the forest around him, a sea of shadows and silver light. He thought of the past, not with guilt, not with longing, but with stillness. He had walked through it, survived it, and now he stood here, older, quieter, but whole. He whispered a prayer, not to any geist or spirit, but to the silence itself. A thank you for the chance to begin again. Inside, the children were sleeping, their dreams light and untroubled. And in the quiet of the orphanage, Kabuto sat once more by the window, watching the moon drift slowly across the sky. He closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in peace. For the first time in his life, the masks had fallen away, and all that remained was a man who had learned, finally, to live.